I spent 3 decades studying the mechanics of great power competition, and I never imagined I would witness the moment when a regional actor in America's backyard would dare to fire upon United States forces with the confidence that comes from knowing the world has fundamentally changed. What happened in the Caribbean waters 48 hours ago was not an aberration or the reckless act of a desperate regime. It was the logical outcome of structural forces I have been analyzing since I published The Tragedy of Great Power Politics in 2001, forces that reveal an uncomfortable truth about American power in the 21st century. The Venezuelan military, emboldened by billions of dollars in Russian arms sales and Chinese economic partnerships worth over $90 billion in the last decade, calculated that Washington's options for retaliation have narrowed to the point where defiance carries acceptable risks. This calculation did not emerge from madness, but from a rational assessment of the international system's architecture, an architecture that no longer revolves around a single dominant power capable of enforcing its will without consequence. The anarchic nature of international politics means that states exist in a self-help system where survival depends on power accumulation and strategic calculation, not on appeals to international law or moral authority. When I outlined the 5 bedrock assumptions of offensive realism, I emphasized that great powers possess offensive military capabilities, face uncertainty about others' intentions, prioritize survival above all else, and think strategically about how to achieve security in a world without a central authority to enforce order. Venezuela's action represents a textbook application of these principles from the perspective of a state that has spent 26 years since Hugo Chávez's rise, building an alliance network specifically designed to counterbalance American hegemony in its own hemisphere. The regime in Caracas observed how the United States spent $7 trillion on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan without achieving decisive political objectives, how Washington imposed sanctions on Russia after Crimea's annexation in 2014 only to watch Moscow deepen its global partnerships, and how Beijing transformed economic leverage into geopolitical influence across 3 continents, while American attention remained fixated on counterterrorism. Understanding this moment requires examining the historical foundation of American dominance in the Western Hemisphere, a dominance codified in President James Monroe's 1823 declaration that European powers would no longer be permitted to colonize or interfere with states in the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine was not merely a policy statement, but an assertion of regional hegemony that assumed the United States possessed both the capability and the will to enforce exclusivity in its sphere of influence. For nearly 2 centuries, Washington invoked this doctrine to justify interventions throughout Latin America, from the 1904 Roosevelt corollary that turned the Caribbean into an American lake, to the 1965 invasion of the Dominican Republic, to decades of support for authoritarian regimes that aligned with U.S. interests against communist expansion. The doctrine rested on 2 pillars: overwhelming military superiority in the hemisphere and the absence of peer competitors willing to challenge American preeminence in the region. Both pillars have eroded in ways that fundamentally alter the strategic landscape. When Hugo Chávez assumed Venezuela's presidency in 1999, he inherited a petrostate that had served as a reliable energy supplier to the United States and a cooperative partner in hemispheric affairs. Chávez recognized that Venezuela's estimated 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest in the world, provided leverage that could be weaponized against American influence if coupled with alternative partnerships that reduced vulnerability to U.S. economic coercion. The Bolivarian Revolution's anti-imperialist rhetoric was not merely ideological posturing, but a deliberate strategy to build a coalition of states and non-state actors opposed to the post-Cold War unipolar order. Chávez cultivated relationships with Cuba, providing subsidized oil worth billions annually in exchange for intelligence services and medical professionals, while simultaneously courting Russia, China, and Iran as counterweights to American power. By the time Nicolás Maduro succeeded Chávez in 2013, Venezuela had signed military cooperation agreements with Moscow worth $11 billion, including purchases of Sukhoi fighter jets, attack helicopters, and air defense systems that significantly upgraded Venezuela's deterrent capabilities. The strategic logic behind these partnerships reflects what I describe as the balancing behavior that inevitably occurs when one state achieves overwhelming dominance in the international system. Russia's interest in Venezuela serves Moscow's broader objective of challenging American hegemony by demonstrating that the Monroe Doctrine no longer holds practical force. In December 2018, Russia deployed two Tu-160 strategic bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons to Venezuela in a symbolic demonstration that great powers now operate freely in America's traditional sphere of influence. Chinese engagement followed a different but complementary pattern, with Beijing providing over $60 billion in loans and investments since 2007, securing access to Venezuelan oil while establishing economic dependencies that make regime change efforts more costly for Washington. Iran contributed technological expertise, particularly in refining capacity and sanctions evasion mechanisms, transforming Venezuela into a node in what some analysts describe as an axis of resistance spanning 3 continents. The combined effect of these partnerships created a protective umbrella that reduced Venezuela's isolation and raised the costs of American intervention beyond what domestic political considerations would tolerate. The sanctions regime Washington imposed on Venezuela beginning in 2015 and expanding dramatically after 2017 represents a case study in the limitations of economic coercion when target states possess alternative partnerships and resources that enable adaptation. U.S. sanctions froze billions in Venezuelan assets, prohibited American companies from doing business with the Venezuelan oil sector, and sought to starve the Maduro regime of hard currency needed to maintain power. The strategy assumed that economic pressure would either force Maduro to negotiate or trigger internal collapse as the population turned against a government unable to provide basic services. Instead, sanctions accelerated Venezuela's pivot toward Russia and China, with Moscow's Rosneft stepping in to purchase Venezuelan oil and provide crucial financial lifelines that sustained the regime through its worst economic crisis. The humanitarian consequences were catastrophic, with millions of Venezuelans fleeing as GDP contracted by 75% between 2013 and 2020. But the political objective of regime change remained elusive because the international system now offers alternatives to states willing to align with American adversaries. What distinguishes the current confrontation from previous moments of tension in U.S. Venezuelan relations is the Trump administration's willingness to escalate beyond economic measures into kinetic operations that create cascading risks of broader conflict. In August 2025, President Trump signed a secret directive authorizing the Pentagon to use military force against select Latin American drug cartels, a mandate that expanded in scope to include covert CIA operations inside Venezuela, authorized in October under what intelligence officials call a presidential finding. The administration framed these actions as counter-narcotics operations, claiming that drug trafficking from Venezuela contributes to the opioid crisis that kills over 100,000 Americans annually and imposes economic costs estimated at $1 trillion per year. This framing provided domestic political justification while obscuring the broader strategic objective articulated by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a Cuban-American hardliner who has made regime change in Venezuela a central priority. The deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group to Caribbean waters, the positioning of F-35 fighter jets at the former Roosevelt Roads Naval Base in Puerto Rico, and reports of planned strikes against Venezuelan military infrastructure signal an escalation that moves beyond coercion into preparation for direct military confrontation. The Venezuelan response, culminating in the incident that precipitated this crisis, reflects calculations about American resolve and the willingness of U.S. adversaries to provide support if confrontation escalates. Maduro signed a decree expanding his military authority in anticipation of American incursion, mobilized reserve forces, and reportedly reached out to Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran for assurances of support in the event of U.S. strikes. The decision to fire upon American forces or assets, whether naval vessels, aircraft, or special operations units conducting reconnaissance, represented a deliberate crossing of a threshold designed to test American credibility. In offensive realist terms, this is the security dilemma manifesting in its most dangerous form, where both sides take actions intended to enhance their security that instead provoke responses escalating toward conflict neither side may want, but both feel compelled to pursue. Venezuela cannot trust American intentions given decades of interventionism and explicit regime change rhetoric, while the United States cannot tolerate armed resistance in its hemisphere without undermining deterrence globally. The broader context of declining American hegemony provides the structural backdrop against which this crisis unfolds. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States emerged as the sole superpower in what Charles Krauthammer termed the unipolar moment, a period when American military, economic, and cultural dominance appeared unchallengeable. That moment lasted approximately 2 decades before systemic forces began eroding the foundations of unipolarity. China's rise as an economic power whose GDP measured in purchasing power parity surpassed America's in 2014 fundamentally altered global economic balances, while Beijing's military modernization challenged U.S. dominance in the Western Pacific. Russia, despite a smaller economy, retained nuclear parity and demonstrated willingness to use force in Georgia, Crimea, and Syria to contest American preferences in its near abroad and beyond. The proliferation of regional powers capable of resisting American pressure, from Iran's entrenchment in the Middle East to Turkey's increasingly independent foreign policy, signaled the transition toward multipolarity that I and other structural realists predicted would occur. The financial dimensions of this transition reveal why military dominance no longer translates automatically into strategic outcomes. The United States spends approximately $800 billion annually on defense, more than the next 10 countries combined, yet this expenditure has not prevented strategic setbacks in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and now potentially Venezuela. The cost of projecting power globally while maintaining commitments to NATO allies, defending Taiwan against potential Chinese action, and deterring adversaries across multiple theaters stretches resources and attention in ways that create opportunities for revisionist states to probe American resolve. China holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities, providing economic leverage that complicates military confrontation, while energy markets increasingly operate outside dollar-denominated systems as Russia, China, and Iran pursue de-dollarization strategies. Venezuela sits atop oil reserves valued in the trillions of dollars at current market prices, resources that make the country strategically valuable to powers seeking to reduce dependence on Middle Eastern energy and build alternative supply chains insulated from American sanctions. The economic stakes of this confrontation extend far beyond Venezuela itself to questions about who controls energy flows, financial systems, and the architecture of global trade in a multipolar world. If you are finding value in this analysis of how great power dynamics shape the crisis unfolding in our hemisphere, I encourage you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you never miss critical geopolitical analysis. Please comment below with your city and country so we can understand where this conversation is reaching around the world. The dilemma facing Washington is that both action and inaction carry strategic costs that undermine American interests in different ways. Military retaliation against Venezuela, whether through airstrikes against regime targets, special operations to decapitate leadership, or a broader invasion to install a friendly government, would demonstrate resolve and potentially deter future challenges from regional actors. The U.S. military possesses overwhelming conventional superiority, and Venezuela's armed forces, weakened by years of corruption, underinvestment, and sanctions that prevented equipment maintenance, would likely be defeated in direct confrontation. However, victory in battle does not guarantee victory in war, a lesson Americans learned painfully in Iraq and Afghanistan, where initial military success gave way to protracted insurgencies that consumed trillions of dollars and thousands of lives without achieving sustainable political outcomes. A U.S. invasion of Venezuela would face resistance not only from regime loyalists, but from irregular forces trained and equipped by Cuban intelligence services, potentially supported by Russian and Iranian advisors with experience in asymmetric warfare. The population, suffering under Maduro but also resentful of American intervention and sanctions that exacerbated their misery, might not welcome liberators as the neoconservatives predicted Iraqis would in 2003. The international response to American military action in Venezuela would further complicate the strategic picture. Russia and China have invested heavily in the Maduro regime and would view its overthrow as a defeat in the broader competition for influence in the global south. Moscow might respond with increased support for anti-American forces elsewhere, from Syria to Africa to potentially even direct military assistance to Venezuelan resistance forces, raising the specter of great power confrontation by proxy. China, already engaged in a comprehensive strategic competition with the United States over technology, trade, and influence in the Indo-Pacific, would likely interpret regime change in Venezuela as confirmation that Washington seeks to roll back Chinese gains globally, potentially accelerating Beijing's timeline for action on Taiwan or other contested areas. Iran, facing its own confrontation with the United States over nuclear programs and regional influence, might view Venezuela as a test case that informs its calculations about American willingness to follow through on threats. The risk of escalation extends beyond Venezuela to the entire structure of international relations, where norms against regime change, respect for sovereignty, and the use of force outside narrow self-defense exceptions have already eroded but retain sufficient salience that blatant violations carry reputational costs. Alternatively, if Washington chooses restraint, accepting the Venezuelan action without kinetic response, the signal sent to allies and adversaries alike would be that American red lines are negotiable and that the costs of challenging U.S. interests in its own hemisphere have declined to the point where even relatively weak states can act with impunity. Every alliance commitment from NATO's Article 5 guarantee to the defense of Taiwan rests on the credibility of American power, the belief that the United States possesses both the capability and the will to respond to aggression against its interests. Credibility is a currency that, once devalued, becomes difficult to restore without dramatic action that carries its own risks. China watches closely to assess whether American defense of the Western Hemisphere suggests similar resolve regarding the Western Pacific. Russia evaluates whether NATO's eastern flank remains genuinely protected or merely rhetorically defended. Iran considers whether escalation in the Middle East would trigger American intervention or further accommodation. The strategic logic of deterrence depends on adversaries believing that crossing certain lines will provoke responses that exceed the benefits of transgression, and that belief requires periodic demonstration through action, not merely threats. The tragedy of great power politics, the title I chose for my examination of these dynamics, lies precisely in this trap where rational security-seeking behavior by multiple actors produces outcomes none prefer, but all feel compelled to pursue. Venezuela seeks security against American regime change efforts by building partnerships with U.S. adversaries and demonstrating resolve through armed resistance. The United States seeks to maintain hemispheric dominance and global credibility by responding to challenges with escalating pressure. Russia, China, and Iran seek to weaken American hegemony by supporting states willing to resist Washington's preferences, calculating that a multipolar world better serves their interests. Each action taken by one side to enhance its security appears threatening to others, provoking responses that increase overall insecurity and move the system toward conflict that might have been avoided if the international system provided mechanisms for credible commitment and enforcement of agreements. No such mechanisms exist in anarchy, and great powers have historically proven unwilling to subordinate their sovereignty to international institutions that might constrain their freedom of action. The Monroe Doctrine's collapse as an enforceable principle illustrates the broader erosion of American hegemony in the unipolar moment's aftermath. When Monroe articulated the doctrine in 1823, the United States lacked the military capability to enforce it, and British naval power provided the actual deterrent against European interference in the Americas. As American power grew through the 19th and 20th centuries, the doctrine evolved from aspiration to reality, with Washington possessing both the means and the will to exclude external powers from hemispheric affairs. The Cold War tested this exclusivity, most dramatically during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, but U.S. willingness to risk nuclear war to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba reinforced that the Western Hemisphere remained an American domain where challenges to U.S. supremacy would not be tolerated. The current crisis reveals that this era has ended, not because American power has disappeared, but because the distribution of power globally has shifted sufficiently that regional actors can find patrons willing to support their defiance, and because the costs of enforcing hegemony have risen to levels that strain American resources and political will. What makes this moment historically significant is not that great powers face challenges, which is constant throughout history, but that the challenge occurs in the geographic region most central to American strategic identity at a time when the United States confronts simultaneous competitions in Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. The overextension of American commitments relative to available resources creates vulnerabilities that adversaries exploit, forcing difficult choices about prioritization that reveal which interests are truly vital versus merely preferred. Is Venezuela worth a war that might cost tens of billions of dollars, hundreds or thousands of American casualties, and the opportunity costs of resources diverted from competition with China? Or is Taiwan more critical, the Middle East more urgent, NATO's eastern flank more symbolic of American credibility? These questions have no objectively correct answers, but reflect judgments about national interests in a world where even the most powerful state cannot pursue all objectives simultaneously. Without exhaustion, the offshore realism I have advocated in other contexts suggests that great powers should prioritize preventing peer competitors from dominating strategic regions while avoiding costly interventions in areas peripheral to core security interests. By this logic, Venezuela matters less than preventing hostile hegemony in Europe or Asia, and resources devoted to regime change in Caracas represent misallocation that weakens American position in theaters of greater consequence. However, this calculation assumes that American credibility is divisible, that restraint in one region does not signal weakness in others, an assumption that adversaries may not share. The interconnected nature of modern geopolitics means that actions in one theater send signals globally, and the perception of American decline becomes self-reinforcing as allies hedge their commitments and adversaries probe for further opportunities. Managing this dynamic requires strategic sophistication that balances resource constraints against the imperative of maintaining deterrence, a balance that neither guarantees success nor offers clear prescriptions for specific crises. The NATO expansion eastward following the Soviet Union's collapse provides the most instructive parallel for understanding how great powers respond when rival alliances approach what they consider core security zones, and the lessons from that expansion illuminate why Venezuela's partnerships with Russia and China follow predictable patterns that American policymakers should have anticipated but apparently dismissed. When I argued against NATO enlargement in the 1990s, the logic was straightforward. Pushing a military alliance historically organized against Russia right up to its borders would provoke exactly the security competition that expansion proponents claimed membership would prevent. The George H.W. Bush administration gave assurances to Soviet leaders that NATO would not expand eastward if Moscow accepted German reunification, assurances that subsequent administrations either forgot or deliberately ignored as Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and eventually Baltic states joined the alliance. By 2008, when NATO promised membership to Georgia and Ukraine at the Bucharest summit, Russia had observed nearly 2 decades of Western disregard for its security concerns and concluded that accommodation would not preserve its sphere of influence. The invasion of Georgia in 2008, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 represent Moscow's violent reassertion of what it considers existential security interests, outcomes that were entirely predictable given the structural dynamics I outlined in The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. The parallel to Latin America becomes clear when we recognize that great powers view their near abroad through the lens of security maximization, not international law or liberal norms about sovereignty and self-determination. Just as Russia could not tolerate NATO bases in Ukraine, a country with which it shares an 200-mile border and deep historical ties, the United States historically has not tolerated hostile military presences in the Western Hemisphere, as the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated when President Kennedy risked nuclear war rather than accept Soviet missiles 90 miles from Florida. The difference today is that Russia and China have learned to project power into America's hemisphere without deploying missiles in ways that trigger existential crises, instead using economic leverage, arms sales, and strategic partnerships that achieve similar objectives of constraining U.S. freedom of action. China's Belt and Road Initiative extended to Latin America in 2018, and Beijing has committed to investing $250 billion in the region over the next decade, dwarfing U.S. economic engagement and creating dependencies that translate into political influence. Chinese companies now operate ports in Panama, Peru, and Brazil, infrastructure that could potentially support military logistics in crisis scenarios, while Venezuela alone has received over $60 billion in Chinese loans since 2007, money that sustained the Maduro regime through economic collapse and sanctions. The economic dimensions of China's penetration into Latin America reflect a broader strategy of using financial tools to reshape global alignments in ways that challenge American hegemony without triggering the direct military confrontation that Beijing seeks to avoid. Chinese foreign direct investment in Latin America reached approximately $4 billion annually by 2022, with 60% concentrated in what analysts call new infrastructure industries, including electric vehicle manufacturing, renewable energy, and information technology sectors that position China at the center of the region's economic modernization. This investment pattern differs fundamentally from the Washington Consensus model that dominated Latin American economic policy in the 1990s, a model that emphasized privatization, deregulation, and fiscal austerity, often implemented through International Monetary Fund conditionality that generated political backlash. China offers an alternative that provides capital without governance lectures, infrastructure without institutional reform demands, and markets without democratic prerequisites, an approach that many Latin American governments find appealing precisely because it does not constrain their domestic political arrangements. The economic statecraft deployed by Beijing leverages China's status as the world's second-largest economy, with GDP of approximately $18 trillion in nominal terms and over $30 trillion in purchasing power parity, resources that enable sustained investment even in countries like Venezuela, where returns are uncertain and risks are substantial. Trump's approach to Latin America reflects an attempt to reassert American dominance through a combination of economic inducements for aligned governments and military pressure against adversaries. But the strategy confronts structural constraints that limit its effectiveness. The administration extended a $20 billion financial package to Argentina's President Javier Milei, a libertarian economist whose anti-communist rhetoric and pro-American orientation align with Trump's ideological preferences, using Treasury Department funds to purchase Argentine pesos and stabilize the exchange rate in a direct intervention that bypasses traditional international financial institutions. This support aims to demonstrate that alignment with Washington brings tangible benefits, creating a model that other Latin American leaders might emulate if they distance themselves from Chinese economic partnerships. Simultaneously, the administration has escalated pressure on Venezuela through naval deployments, covert operations, and threats of military action, attempting to demonstrate that defiance carries unacceptable costs. The strategy assumes that carrots for friends and sticks for adversaries will re-establish American preeminence, but this calculus underestimates how much the regional balance of power has shifted and how limited American options have become when adversaries possess external support that insulates them from U.S. pressure. The financial costs of sustaining American global dominance provide context for understanding why resource allocation decisions carry such strategic weight. The United States spent $997 billion on defense in 2024, representing nearly 40% of total global military expenditure and more than the next 9 countries combined. Yet this massive investment has not prevented strategic setbacks in multiple theaters. China, with defense spending of $314 billion, achieves greater strategic impact per dollar spent by concentrating resources in its near abroad, where geography provides advantages and where core interests justify sustained commitment. Russia, spending $149 billion annually, leverages asymmetric capabilities including cyber operations, information warfare, and tactical nuclear weapons to challenge American interests at a fraction of the cost the United States spends defending the global order. The disparity between expenditure and outcomes reveals the paradox of hegemony, where maintaining global dominance requires resources that exceed the returns from that dominance, particularly when adversaries can impose costs through asymmetric means that exploit American vulnerabilities. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan illustrate how conventional military superiority translates poorly into sustainable political outcomes when adversaries adopt irregular warfare strategies that exploit occupiers' weaknesses. The United States spent approximately $2 trillion on the Iraq War between 2003 and 2020, according to the Costs of War project at Boston University, a figure that includes direct military operations, reconstruction efforts, and veterans' health care, but excludes broader economic costs and interest on debt incurred to finance the war. Afghanistan consumed an additional $3 trillion over 2 decades, with $825 billion in direct military expenditure and billions more in reconstruction that produced minimal lasting impact after the Taliban's return to power in 2021. These interventions demonstrated that regime change requires not merely toppling governments, but building functional states capable of maintaining order and legitimacy, tasks that proved far more difficult and expensive than initial planners anticipated. The Venezuelan military and intelligence services studied these campaigns closely, learning that protracted resistance against technologically superior forces can achieve strategic objectives by imposing unsustainable costs on occupiers whose domestic populations eventually lose patience with endless wars. If this analysis of great power competition and the structural forces reshaping global order resonates with your understanding of current events, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications so you receive future content. Comment below with your city and country so we can see where this conversation is reaching around the world. The de-dollarization initiatives pursued by BRICS nations represent a long-term threat to American financial hegemony that potentially undermines one of the United States' most potent sources of power, the dollar's role as the global reserve currency that allows Washington to finance deficits, impose sanctions, and project power at lower cost than would otherwise be possible. The BRICS Summit in Kazan, Russia in October 2024 advanced proposals for a cross-border payment system that would enable member nations to conduct transactions in local currencies without dollar intermediation, reducing transaction costs while diminishing American ability to weaponize access to dollar-denominated financial systems. The bloc expanded in 2024 to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates alongside original members Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, represents roughly 42% of the global population and approximately 36% of global GDP measured in purchasing power parity, economic weight that makes alternatives to dollar hegemony increasingly viable. China holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities, providing leverage in any confrontation while simultaneously working to reduce dependence on dollar reserves through currency swap agreements, establishment of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and promotion of yuan-denominated trade that bypasses American financial oversight. The strategic implications of declining American hegemony extend beyond any single crisis in Venezuela to questions about the international order's basic architecture and whether the rules-based system that Washington constructed after World War II retains legitimacy and enforceability in a multipolar world where rising powers reject American primacy. The liberal international order that the United States championed was never truly universal, but rather reflected American power and preferences encoded as universal principles. From free trade regimes that benefited the world's largest economy to human rights norms that justified intervention in countries that violated Western standards. As American power declines relative to rising challengers, these norms lose their taken-for-granted quality and become contested, with China promoting alternative models of authoritarian capitalism, Russia defending traditional sovereignty against humanitarian intervention, and middle powers increasingly pursuing independent foreign policies that hedge between great power blocs. The Venezuelan crisis encapsulates this transition, where a relatively weak state can defy American preferences because the unipolar moment that made such defiance suicidal has given way to multipolarity that offers protection through alignment with U.S. adversaries. The security dilemma that traps both the United States and Venezuela in escalatory dynamics operates at multiple levels, from the bilateral relationship to the broader competition between democratic and authoritarian governance models. Venezuela cannot trust American intentions given the history of U.S. interventions throughout Latin America, from the 1954 coup in Guatemala to support for military dictatorships during the Cold War to the 1989 invasion of Panama, and more recently, regime change operations in Libya and attempts in Syria that validated fears about American willingness to overthrow governments that resist its preferences. This distrust drives Venezuela to build partnerships with Russia, China, and Iran that enhance deterrence against American action, but simultaneously appear threatening from Washington's perspective, where collaboration with U.S. adversaries confirms that the Maduro regime represents a hostile presence in the hemisphere. The United States, for its part, views any challenge to its hemispheric dominance as potentially cascading into broader retreat from global leadership, where restraint in Venezuela might embolden China regarding Taiwan, Russia regarding NATO's eastern flank, or Iran regarding nuclear weapons development. Both sides take actions to enhance security that reduce overall security, the tragic dynamic that characterizes international politics in anarchy, where no authority exists above states to enforce agreements or provide credible security guarantees. The moral dimension of this crisis, often obscured by realist analysis that focuses on power and interests, nevertheless shapes how American audiences perceive the stakes and what costs they will tolerate in pursuit of policy objectives. The Maduro regime has presided over Venezuela's transformation from one of Latin America's wealthiest countries into a humanitarian catastrophe, where GDP collapsed by 75% between 2013 and 2020, inflation reached levels exceeding 1 million% at its peak, and over 7 million citizens fled to neighboring countries in one of the world's largest refugee crises. The regime maintains power through repression, election fraud, and violence against opposition figures, creating a moral case for intervention that appeals to American values about supporting democracy and human rights. However, the complexity arises in recognizing that U.S. Sanctions contributed significantly to Venezuelan suffering by restricting access to international finance, preventing oil exports that could generate revenue for imports, and accelerating economic collapse that might have been less severe under targeted sanctions that focused on regime elites rather than broad measures that hurt ordinary citizens. The ethical calculus becomes further complicated when considering that military intervention would likely produce additional casualties, potentially trigger refugee flows that dwarf current levels, and risk protracted conflict that could consume American resources and attention for years or decades. The question of whether American credibility requires military response to Venezuelan defiance touches on fundamental issues about what constitutes national interest in the 21st century and whether the costs of maintaining global hegemony exceed the benefits that hegemony provides. From one perspective, credibility represents the currency of deterrence, and allowing Venezuela to fire upon American forces without devastating retaliation signals weakness that invites additional challenges across multiple theaters. Allies in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East observe how the United States responds to provocations, calibrating their own alignment decisions based on assessments of American resolve and capability. If Washington tolerates armed resistance in its own hemisphere, why would Taiwan trust American commitment to defend it against Chinese invasion? Or why would Poland believe that NATO's Article 5 guarantee would trigger American intervention against Russian aggression? The interconnected nature of U.S. security commitments means that failure in one region potentially undermines credibility globally, creating a logic that demands response regardless of Venezuela's intrinsic strategic value. The alternative perspective recognizes that not all challenges warrant military response and that distinguishing between vital interests and peripheral concerns represents strategic wisdom rather than weakness. Venezuela possesses significant oil reserves but does not control choke points essential to global commerce, does not threaten American territory, and lacks capability to project power beyond its immediate neighborhood even with Russian and Chinese support. The resources required to overthrow the Maduro regime, occupy Venezuela, and build a stable successor government could easily exceed $100 billion over a decade, resources that have alternative uses in modernizing American military capabilities to compete with China, rebuilding domestic infrastructure that would enhance long-term economic competitiveness, or reducing deficits that impose fiscal constraints on future policy options. The opportunity costs of intervention become particularly salient when considering that China represents the only potential peer competitor capable of challenging American dominance in critical domains including advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and military technology, and that maintaining superiority in great power competition requires concentrating resources rather than dispersing them across multiple theaters of declining strategic importance. The tragedy in this situation is that both action and inaction carry risks, and no choice guarantees outcomes that advance American interests without imposing substantial costs. Military intervention demonstrates resolve but risks quagmire, escalation with great power adversaries, and the diversion of resources from higher priorities. Restraint preserves resources and avoids military entanglement, but potentially signals declining American power that emboldens adversaries and worries allies. The absence of good options reflects deeper structural forces associated with hegemonic decline, where the hegemon faces ever more difficult trade-offs between maintaining commitments and managing resource constraints. History suggests that hegemons rarely manage this transition gracefully, either overextending in attempts to preserve dominance or retrenching so precipitously that they invite challenges that could have been deterred through more calibrated responses. The United States now confronts this dilemma in Venezuela, where the stakes extend far beyond one country's internal politics to fundamental questions about American power, international order, and whether the unipolar moment's end proceeds toward competitive multipolarity or descends into instability that threatens the prosperity and security that the post-World War II order provided.